Welcome everyone to our first virtual SEGRA keynote presentation. My name is Kate Charters and I'm the chair of SEGRA, which is the acronym for Sustainable Economic Growth for Regional Australia. And SEGRA is recognised as Australia's most credible independent voice on issues affecting regional, rural and remote Australia. Our platform today doesn't permit conversation from over 100 registrants, but you'll see that there's a chat box at the bottom, and if you would put your comments in that or questions, type furiously while Anthony's speaking, and then we'll get to as many as we can at the end of it. Today is the first in a series of virtual keynote speakers, and I'm delighted to welcome Anthony Hogan to address the question of beyond crisis shaping the parameters, the viability of regional communities. Anthony is the Honorary Research Professor at both Charles Sturt University and the University of Sydney. Anthony's undertaken extensive research on issues impacting on the sustainability of rural communities. Born in Coonabarabran, this issue remains close to his heart. Anthony has published 7 books and over 100 monograms and research articles, so we're delighted to have you. Anthony is also the editor of the book Rural and Regional Futures, and it's a great read. So if you haven't already done so, Rural and Regional Futures, it's a great book. Welcome, Anthony. I'm also pleased to welcome to the conversation Ian Doyle, whom some of you may remember as an ABC journalist. Ian was born and educated in North Queensland, and he holds a Bachelor of Economics and a Diploma of Education. After teaching in North Queensland for a few years, he joined the ABC in Sydney in 1981 and worked as a radio and television producer and executive producer within the rural department of the ABC for 16 years. And so we have 2 people who are deeply steeped in regional Australia. So if I can hand over to you now, Anthony. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Okay, oops, I didn't do the share screen. Okay, can you see me? Can you see the screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. You might notice on the first screen that I slightly changed the name of this presentation from the parameters that shape regional viability to shaping the parameters. And this is part of my thinking as we go forward on what I'm actually trying to achieve with my work and my thinking at the moment. This piece of work came out of the fires, particularly down here in the southeast of the ACT and New South Wales over Christmas. And particularly when Scott Morrison came on the news and said that we're going to rebuild all our communities that have been burnt and it's going to be business as usual and these communities will be back on track in no time at all. And I sat back and I said, oh, really, is this more of the same? Is this really what we want to be doing? You know, yes, we've had our bushfires, we had, smoke, and we've had the fires, but parting away in the background are other issues of more extreme hot weather events, seasonal shift. Coastal inundation is puttering along in the background. There's so much other things going on in the news at the moment that coastal inundation is not getting the headlines, but it's happening. It was just an article on the coast west of Melbourne in the papers this week. Up the east coast of Australia, there's lots of stories of coastal inundation going on. And the other thing that struck us during the fires is the loss of mobility we had. Communities were shut out, we were shut down, our major roads were lost. One road was out of action for 5 weeks, our major highway, because of the fires. And the other one, shortly after, the 2 most enormous granite boulders you can ever imagine managed to plonk themselves entirely in the middle of the 2 lanes going down Brown Mountain and had to be exploded to get rid of. And it really brought home to me the fragility of our infrastructure and the question of whether our regional communities are just places that are there to have stuff ripped out of for the cities, or whether there's another purpose. And hence the subtitle of my talk today in terms of Towards Regions 2050, and really setting a vision, but also a timeline, a generational timeline for what we're trying to achieve. The photo on the left of your screen is the village of Quorma near Cobargo in the southeast of New South Wales, which was hit in our New Year's Day fires. Okay, I just want to give you a thumbnail of where this talk's going to go. I appreciate that people listening and watching may have been affected by these events, and I'm sensitive to that. We were. One of the slides will be the view of the fires from our balcony. But I want to talk about the fact that we're experiencing shocks. I want to talk about the fact that regional policy in Australia is basically focused on infrastructure, and that in itself is an inadequate policy for what we actually want to achieve. And even though that we'll be talking about large pots of money in our terms, in real terms, it's chicken feed. I want to talk about what the place that regions can take in Australia into the future. And I particularly want to focus on the change in thinking, which was developed in Europe over 10 years ago, but just has not cut through in the Australian logic in the thinking. And I want to wrap up with us thinking about ourselves as policy makers, not policy takers. And I think the problem that we've had is that Canberra comes up with an announcement. It's a one size fits all, and off you go, kiddies, and have a good time and play with the Vegemite and the M&Ms that we send out to you to use. And it's just not enough. It's just not good enough. And I really want to emphasize that, you know, as we've seen across history, times like this where we are in crisis are times when massive changes can occur in policies in our settings. And one of the things that I've taken from this fantastic lecture series from SEGRA is that we need to move beyond the detail in which we're in and start looking at the bigger picture, and particularly start looking at our connectivities, because we're not going to be able to do some of this stuff as individual regions, as individual communities, I should say. We need to look at our networked economy and our connectivities, and that's a particular something that I hope we can come back to. I want to deal about the issue that we're very much in at the moment, which is future shock. We're just getting whacked by one shock after another. Droughts, heat, fire, COVID, economy. It's really taking its toll. I was watching a documentary last night on the impact in the East Gippsland. And of course, this all comes in the back of, you know, we're seeing declining businesses, but we know that there's been a history of rural decline. And we've had decades of regional policy where basically they're Vegemiting money around. Basically, each region might get 1 or 2 million a year for something or other, and then another 1 million or 2 if you can partner with someone. But there's a lot of drying on the vine policy. You know, if you all just quietly die on the vine, you all go one at a time. No one really notices, and there's no crisis, and we don't have to deal with the big issue. So that's kind of the policy out there in the background. Save, of course, for places like Port Hedland, where you get a massive infrastructure. Of course, we're ripping stuff out and sending it somewhere, and those places do get money. At the moment, there's this concept, old concept of anomie, where we're not only we're experiencing future shock, but the rules around how we live our lives are kind of all been shaken up in the air, and really our taken for granted can no longer be taken for granted. Here in the southeast, you know, we're still very much recovering from bushfires. All our national parks around Canberra are closed. We can't go into them. Down at the community level, people are just still clearing their blocks and starting to try and get back on board. We lost Christmas, we lost the summer holidays, we've lost Easter, we've lost school holidays, and lots of businesses and lots of communities are in trouble. The picture on your left-hand side here is of our national parks dropping in sweet potatoes into our national parks to feed the wildlife, because all the food has been wiped out. Climate change is on the agenda. We've got the terms of trade. This week we've got the barley crisis with China. Who knows what we're in, the meat crisis, who knows what will be next. The industry base of our communities has been constantly changing. Remote operators, you know, we can run our farms from a distance. We can run our cotton pickers from a distance, fly in, fly out. For some years now, I've been working on the idea of the bypassed economy. Once upon a time, industry was central to rural economy, but now we can have new industries coming into communities, as we know, with dongas and whatever, and actually don't have any impact on our local economies. They don't feed into us, they don't help us. And why are we doing this? COVID, of course, we're all, you know, ISOs, experiencing our social isolation, the economic burdens which we are experiencing, small business in particular. We will see further shifts now. You know, we already had to wait and travel to get our health services in regional Australia. The reliance on external providers may increase. We're seeing a loss of workers from particular areas because they're being sucked into towns where they can get more reliable work. And we've really, and this is the point I really want to focus on in our logic as regional communities, is that there's a huge reliance on the visitor economy, and regions and towns in particular need to understand what is their economic base and the proportion which your town, your community is actually a service economy, not actually an agricultural or a mining town, but your reliance on the nomads and the other people who come through, be it for 3 months of the year or 2 months of the year, that keeps you going for the rest of the time. Climate's a given, and I'm going to you can see there on your screen all the impacts that we're dealing with. I'm going to scoot through some of this stuff because I've only got 25 minutes, and you can pop up in your questions and your comments and we can come back to those shortly. There's a thing that I want to talk about diswelfares, and that's the cost to a community of doing stuff that benefits others. And I would contend there's lots of costs to regional communities for us being there in the way that we've serviced cities for so long. But in the context of all the changes at the moment, be it fires, floods, inundations, and so forth, and climate, you can see that there are lots of costs that people are enduring, not least of which is the loss of community flora and fauna, but physical costs also in terms of, we're seeing now about 1 in 10 houses are likely to be put in what they call the red zone because of fire, floods, and changing weather climates will become uninsurable. We're talking about a retreat from the bush and a retreat from the coast because of adverse fire risk events. That we're talking about insurance policy driving policy decisions because you won't be able to afford to be in certain places. And one of the questions that's very much on the table is, how do we pay for these transitions and who pays for it? And one of the problems with the drying on the vine policy is that we just let the costs lie where they fall. Your house fell into the ocean, that's now Crown land again, bad luck, move on. Versus say, like for example, in Canberra, where we had an asbestos crisis through Mr. Fluffy insulation, where the Canberra community paid for the cost of buying people out and rehousing people. They bought their own houses, but we bought off the dud properties off them. We're in a huge era of change. Globally, we're seeing a rise of authoritarianism and high risk of fascism, to be frank. Changes in population, we're very much experiencing changes in social relations and ways of living and ways of learning. And for at least the next 2 years, this is going to be part of our reality. And if there's no vaccine, then it's a longer term reality. The economic base is changing. Retail is in massive crisis. The shift to online has been accelerated by COVID. Technology is on the rise. I've mentioned climate and our environment issues. We've been talking for some time about adaptive capacity as being critical to long-term regional communities. And central to that is a leadership in our towns that can embrace change and a leadership that is participative and inclusive. Because what do we see from our research? Surprise, surprise, the men's shed and the sports club is more influential than the CWA, that not everyone is equal at the decision-making table. And that there's an elite in town who, as I would say, run the sports club, own God, and what they say goes. That's not sufficient in going forward in terms of building the kind of communities we're going to need into the future. And the other question that I want to put to you is that the narrative of the regions in the Australian story is rapidly changing. And we need to, as we've seen in the previous papers and discussions, move away from the me, oh my, poor old regions. Come and help us, we're desperate, to a whole new narrative. And it's there, but we're not bringing it forward. You can see from the slide here that there's lots of great stuff about regionality. And certainly if COVID's sustained and people can't get their trains and buses to work, living in regional Australia is going to look terrific. COVID's made Canberra look incredibly appealing because of our spaces, our accessibility, the way we move about our city. But the key issue is particularly, we've got all the lifestyle, but the key issue is livelihoods. How do we feed ourselves and our communities to make us long-term sustainable? And that's one of the issues we really haven't as a nation taken on with regards to our regions. I'm not saying that the regions haven't been doing it. I know their economic development officers listening to this presentation who've been doing this stuff for eons. But it's the livelihoods question which our policymakers haven't come to terms with because they're still focused on ripping stuff out of us rather than actually understanding that regions are places where people live and have livelihoods. And our question is, well, how do we sustain this? To me, it's a public policy question because public policy is there to deliver the outcomes that we want. The question is, how do we shape the policy agenda to meet our needs rather than the people's needs who want the stuff that we give? So there are lots of stuff that, as you can see on this screen, that policy can achieve in terms of well-being. We're seeing a lot of work on protecting community safety lately, but equality, economy, international relationships. But government policy there is to fix the problems that we define, and it's about what they choose or not to do. And to date, I'm going to contend that they haven't really chosen to do a lot about sustaining our regional communities, and that in fact there's quite a logic in Canberra would suggest that it's really not particularly high on the agenda. It's not to say that it's not there, but it's not the thing that drives the agenda. What drives the agenda at the moment is this, what we call the staples thesis, how we rip stuff out of our community. But if we don't think that this is acceptable and we think that change is required, then we need to, as a collective, to be articulating what it is we want and how we need to go forward and how it's going to be paid for. So I contend in this presentation that too much of our regional policy is just simply focused on infrastructure. And a lot of that infrastructure is focused on building stuff, better roads and bridges that get stuff out of town. I remember when I was working in Scottsdale in Tasmania in the northeast, at a community meeting, people complained that the biggest problem they faced was the fact that there were 13 sets of traffic lights between Scottsdale and the market where they exported stuff out of Devonport. And that was the big thing that needed to be changed, rather than the fact that, 75% of that community was dependent on a forestry industry that was no longer there. We need to kind of be thinking about what underpins our economies. And I'm going to go through some examples here of some of the funding programs. We're spending something like $300 billion over 10 years on infrastructure, and you can see a lot of it's going into transport in the cities, the light rail and so forth. But you look at that number, 300 billion over 10 years. We're just spending 350 billion at the moment on COVID. And the government's position is we're not raising taxes, nothing's going to change, and we'll recover that money through productivity gains. The money already needs to be significantly larger for the regions, and to shift the focus away from the staples thesis of taking stuff out, shift the focus from simply being the infrastructure that gets stuff out, and also to address the issue that policymakers in the cities really want people to move to regional Australia, but they haven't come to terms with the fact that giving people $5,000 to pay for the removalists is not sufficient motivation to go. There's a whole bunch of stuff that comes out of our research that says roads, schools, sports, justice, connectivity, bridge and road repairs, etc., are cost of entry. If we want people to live in the region, people just, from our research, are showing they just expect that stuff will be there. And then they're looking for their livelihoods and how am I going to live there, and am I going to be welcomed, and will I be part of a community? The picture on your bottom right is one of our major arterial roads on the southeast of New South Wales. And I want you to imagine trying to get a couple of big trucks across there at the same time. But when I took that photo, just before that, and this is over Christmas, this bridge was a 40K bridge because it was in trouble, and it really couldn't take the pressure of high-speed, heavy vehicles. And again, this is where our infrastructure money is going. And Kate Fitzpatrick the other day was talking about, putting a money into a bridge here and a money into a bridge there, and that's our allocation for the year. Well, it's really, when you think of the miles and miles and miles of roads we have in our country, there's one bridge, it just doesn't cut it. Again, the National Stronger Regions program, look, in terms of us, it seems like big dollars, but when you get down to, the rounds of money going out, 200 million at a time, for me, and it equates to at a regional level, there's a few big winners. So like Busselton at the moment is getting an airport upgrade so that you can fly from Melbourne over to Busselton and enjoy Margaret River. There's some good ideas, and people are also still building some white elephants, yet another regional museum that no one will come to. My contention is, and I'm not saying that the projects in themselves don't warrant merit. That's not the point. A medical centre at Harden Murrumbara, a grain haulage facility, fixing up stuff. Arts projects, we're not saying that these things aren't important. I'm just saying it's just entry level. When I went through the 2013 regional development plans, we came up with $50 billion worth of projects if we added everything together that everyone wanted to do. But we know in those plans we went blah, 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 we need all the things and we want a bridge. Well, here's a bridge that needs replacing. This again on one of the arterial roads in Southeast Australia, because just after the fires we had a flood, didn't we? So when the roads weren't closed by fires, they were closed by flood. So our funding needs to shift from cost of entry of us, just the fact that we are there. And the key message that's coming out of Europe is how we grow endogenous economic capacity. In other words, rather than stuff just gets ripped out of us, how is it that we are growing local economy, and what does it take to grow that? What's the investment, and what is what we call the role of the entrepreneurial state? Because we've seen across many crises, but not just in crises, but in reality, the Australian company like Cochlear, the bionic ear people, would not be there if it wasn't for the entrepreneurial state. The government has a whole program that invests in technology. Apple would not exist. The internet would not exist if it wasn't for the entrepreneurial state who invested in ideas like this. So it's not out of the realms of realism to be putting these issues on the agenda, but we've got to be clear about what we want. This is a blah, blah slide in the sense that there's an enormous amount of information on here. But basically what I want you to look from the left and the right is actually the right and the left. There's a whole bunch of old economic policy that kind of drove the way we make decisions. There's a whole bunch on the right-hand side of the screen about what the new decisions might be in terms of how we shape our economic platform going forward, from stuff, not just having a budgetary vision, but local decision-making, the entrepreneurial state, but new physical and monetary measures, particularly given that, you know, monetary policy, we're down to almost zero. We've flogged that dog and there's not much left in it, is there? We're going to have to go to a new way of thinking. But also the new way of thinking is this thing called the circular economy, where we stop wasting stuff and we really recycle the opportunities of clean energy. There's a whole change going on, and it's not about business as usual. And our thinking is to get beyond future shock and get ahead of the shock cycle, with a longer term vision about where we're going to go and how we're going to get there. Did I just jump 2 slides? The other thing that we need to do is to deal with the new narrative. The regions in Australia, for a long time, when we first settled Australia, we needed people out in the bush to feed the colonies because the colonies were starving. Then agriculture became central to the national survival and the economy, and we rode on the sheep's back, and agriculture particularly, and then mining was a big part of GDP. And people like me who grew up in the bush ended up in the city, but we've still got relatives running farms and whatever. And certainly post Second World War, which is the policy settings we're still dealing with, it was very much about, you know, we rip out stuff from the country, but we look after people there because they're critical to our nation's survival. But the fact of the matter now is that GDP from agriculture is 3%. If you watch Landline on the weekend, you would have seen, you know, the majority of our beef and our grain, etc., is exported. We don't need a great deal of what's produced in regional Australia for Australia to survive. But there's this constant dialogue that we need the cities to keep us alive, and that, you know, and that you'll provide our roads and our schools and our police, etc., so we can live out in these dangerous places and produce what you need. I think that story has changed. I think a lot of our regional economy now is service economy, and we're actually providing services to cities. They come to us to consume rather than we're ripping stuff out and sending it to the city. And if people are coming to us, then we have customers and they have needs and they have profiles, and we need to understand those. We need to understand how we're going to meet those. In Omeo last night, in places they were talking about, you know, we've had a really bad time, you need to come and spend your money and save us. Let me be mean. Well, why? Why would I do that? What's going on here? We're not just here to give some kind of, you know, good old agrarian welfare. What is it, you know, if you actually are a service economy, a tourist economy or whatever, then there's a different language that goes on. We're no longer victims. But to get change, we need to be really intentional about what we want to do. We become the policy makers, and we're going to set the parameters, and I'm going to put some of those parameters to you shortly. I'll talk about geographies of capacity. The Newcastle RDA talks about, you know, how lots of communities looking at new forms of energy production. And the key point that the CEO there makes is that we can't just look at this as doing it ourselves. We are actually part of an interconnected community that has an energy community that we're a part of. Collie, in terms of smart specialisation, for a long time in Western Australia, generated and was the hub for coal-powered electricity for Western Australia. And they are part of a geographic economy. And in their transition, they're going to new forms of energy production whilst remaining the connective point of power distribution for large parts of WA. We have to understand that not necessarily doing it by ourselves is the way forward. So lots of things, you know, we're already seeing education and training changing, and I'm going to skip on from that. We can come back to it if we need to. So in 8 minutes, leading from the regions. So what might be the policy framework that we will begin to develop? And if you're asking at your local government area or wherever, what's this got to do with me, is that I think it's got everything to do with us, in the sense that if we don't have a collective, coherent hymn sheet to sing from, we're not going to have a coherent voice in Canberra, and we're not going to be able to take an agenda forward, because it's too easy to Vegemite and divide and conquer. So what's the limits of the existing approach? Vegemiting money around, investing money that just enables infrastructure to take stuff out, rather than how we invest big dollars in localised growth that enables us to build sustainable industries. We need to get beyond the idea that a couple of $1 million is a lot of money, and that and actually come to terms with the fact that we're being Vegemited. We need to be talking to the Commonwealth about the idea of policies that have outcomes. Australian National Audit Office says the problem with lots of the work going on, certainly in the regions, is there's no assessment, which is Vegemite money. No one actually poses the question or evaluates, did it make a difference? Did it improve our local viability? What kind of outcome did it have? Let's move beyond just getting it to market quicker and easier. Important, but we're not just places to suck stuff out of. And when we look at these little towns, certainly in my community and down in the Gippslands and whatever, is, where's our strategy? Where's our vision? Now, certainly the Gippslands are re-envisioning themselves beyond coal and coal-powered fire. These are the questions to go forward with. What is our vision? So on the left-hand side of here, we can see this screen, we can see that livability is a huge asset that the regions can offer. We have connectivity, sustainability, our blocks are big enough to grow our food on. We have work-life balance. Housing had been affordable till Sydney and Melbourne just certainly decided to invade the regions. We have more participative decision-making, but it could be better. We've certainly got nature and the outback and the like. We have lots of places for holiday and recreation. Key issue is livelihoods. The EU says, let's fuel it by smart specialisation. And this has got 4 examples up here for you. On Landline on the weekend, we had a chap in Ballarat who used to make gold detectors and suddenly is making ventilators in collaboration with other people in the community. And I'm going, I don't know how you get a ventilator out of a gold detector, but he's doing it. And he's created a collectivity that's doing it. We're seeing in the Hunter repurposing a coal-fired power station to produce energy from biomass. We saw in Derby in Tasmania create a fantastic internationally noted mountain bike trail for tourism. And we see up in the outback in Queensland and Winton and the like, dinosaur tourism. So smart specialisation asks the questions, what are we good at? What are our assets and capabilities? And how can these be repurposed? And let's take the Hunter. The Hunter has heaps of people with engineering skills. How can we reuse those engineering skills to do other stuff that will provide livelihoods? And who do we need to partner with to achieve this? We maybe not as our town be able to do this by ourselves. And critically, what is the scale we need to be working on and the timeline that we're working on? Because we need to move out of the quick fix political announcement, we're going to give you $5 million and woohoo, it's all going to be great, because it's not enough money, it ain't big enough, and it's not going to happen. These kind of things take a lot longer. If we're going to have our regions there in 2050, or we're just going to let more die on the vine stuff. So looking at the parameters of what might be a new regional Australia, it's rapidly becoming a very desirable place to live and to be, and that we are increasingly service economies, fueled with new industries from smart specialisation. But we're going to make policies and we're going to shape Canberra's thinking. We're not going to have Canberra just dumping their one-size-fits-all on us. Of course, we'll have coherable, doable, collective visions. One of the things we certainly saw in the current crises is complete absence of continuity planning. People's idea of a continuity plan was a couple of days or a week, not the kind of crisis we're in. Beyond cost of entry, outcomes-based funding, servicing people who come to us rather than us sending stuff to them, and particularly being a welcome community. That if we want people, certainly in our smaller towns, to come, we need to show them a bloody good time, what I call Kentucky Narrabri. If we want young people to come, we want to come give them a hoot of a time. We saw in St George where they had a strategy in place where they got people to come, and people got together and lined up who they would marry, married them into the community and got them to stay. That was how they got the largest number of GPs per capita in Australia. So to start thinking about, because if you think about, if you really got time for anyone else in your life, new people and so forth, and if I come to town, are you really going to make me welcome? How am I going to fit in, or has just got to find my space? And but the fact of the matter, in many of our towns now, only a third are born and bred locals, 2/3 are blow-ins. And how do we make people feel welcome and part and want to live here for a long time? Why does Canberra work as a community? Canberra works as a community because 2/3 of us are blow-ins, and we all know it, and we support each other. And that's a message for smaller communities. If you want people to come, you want them to stay. But also you bring a family, not an individual. And so how do we meet the needs? If I come and my wife's a GP, she might need to go back to Sydney 3 times a year, or to Brisbane or wherever for her training. We're going to package it so that's financially viable for them to do that. My last point, we've got to stop thinking like colonials. We've got to move away from our colonial hubs of Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, and Perth and the like, and start thinking like regions. There's a really good crisis here. Are we going to let it go to waste, or are we going to leverage policy change? The settings can be changed. If Australia can weather a $350 billion hit from COVID without changing taxes or parameters, in an era where every expert is saying tax reform needs to be on the agenda, the GST needs to be revisited, there are new opportunities for changing taxes and raising incomes. Surely can't we establish an Australian Regions Fund for 2050 that has a vision of where we're going to go, how we're going to get there, and the kind of money that's going to take to get there and get beyond Vegemite? So shaping regional policy. And the key thing that's missing here I haven't talked about is a new structure, a new framework that gives this whole issue leadership that takes us forward, that comes from the ground up, that's able to cater for the many, many, many differing local circumstances. Our friend Jen Cleary down in Port Augusta says, if you've seen one country town, you've seen one country town, and our policy needs to be able to deal with that. Beyond cost of entry, investing in endogenous growth, a networked regional economy, but also we accept the fact that not every community is going to make it, and that we're not going to let them dry on the vine, that there'll be just and fair transitions. If we can exit people out of dairy and other industries, we can look at how other communities who are not going to make it can transition fairly. So, summing up, they're my key takeaway points, and we might come back to those later. I'm out of time, and I'll hand over to the chair.
Anthony, that was a stimulating presentation, and one which I think you've chucked a few hand grenades into the regional story. There are a number of people who are asking questions, and the presentation is coming up on your screen at the moment saying it was excellent. It was excellent, and thank you. I mean, if I could clap, I would, but no one would hear me very much. It's done like that. Questions, and there's lots of them. We've had questions from John Mears and Gordon Hay and Tom Allen, and Kate's done a great job in responding during the course of your presentation. But there's one we'll come back to about mental health in relation to John Mears shortly. But the general question to you, Anthony, is: are you in fact wanting a revolution to occur in Australia? Are you a lefty bomb thrower who's determined to shake the place up?
The politicians tell me I'm a moderate. But we do need, when I was at uni, there was a book that I read that said, don't feel sorry for me, don't mourn for me, organise. And this is not about a revolution. This is about just getting our shite together and doing this not as, there's a bundle of money there, I'm going to make sure that my council gets as much of it as I can and stuff everybody else. It's about, we're actually all in this boat together in a similar fashion, be it Marble Bar to Cloncurry. What are the issues that are impacting on us, our structural, they're systemic? And we've all been policy takers. Collectively, we're a third of the electorate. That's, 3 seats in every 10 in the Senate belong to regional Australia. It's a huge influence in the parliament if you chose to exercise it. So look, some gentle nudging and focusing the attention of our politicians is not out of the question. I think they take our vote for granted. I don't think it matters who you vote for. Next time, vote for the other person.
So that's a suggestion. That's a serious suggestion. It's been said before that the only way that regional Australia is going to get the sort of change you're talking about and the numbers that you're talking about is to change the way they vote.
Yeah.
And until such time as that occurs, nothing will happen. Until Canberra takes regional Australia seriously, then it'll be same old, same old.
We've developed what we call the Narrabri Statement, which we developed out in the cotton communities about 10 years ago. But we could have during our run up to our elections a Q&A where Kate, I can share this with you for distribution to listeners if they're interested. But to put it to our members and ask them, will they sign off on it? So we don't have to change our vote, but we can ask people to sign off on something like the Narrabri Statement, which embodies all these principles that I've been talking to, and I've been refining it in preparing this talk today. So, but also to put it out there for people to play with and to change it, because my stuff, if you like, is first draft. But the question is very much there, and I think you nailed it, Ian. How do we organise in a way that we take it forward? And look, if we have to gently sway the vote a bit, you can sway it without turning it over, but to exercise the pressure.
Did the experiment with the three amigos and Prime Minister Gillard give you an indication of what could happen if regional Australia collectively put their mind to it? Because that experiment that lasted for 3 years, as I've spoken to you before about, resulted in huge improvement for those electorates, but you need it for the whole of Australia.
Yeah, because at the time, Simon Crean, who was the Minister for Infrastructure and Regional Australia, said quite openly what Ian wants, Ian Windsor, what Ian wants, Ian gets. It was not negotiable, wasn't for discussion. He just got it. So
his name
Tony Windsor, what Tony wants.
That's your name, Tony, not mine.
I should have got that. What he wants, he gets.
Yeah.
But that's it. And they just held a one-seat majority, but it wasn't enough and it wasn't sustained. So we get another go at this. And so the question is, how do we organise, and do we have a shared set of values here that we want to take forward? I think the sustained interest in the region suggests we do have shared values, and that we do have something to offer, and we can take it forward.
You've had to deal with regional councils in the past. I've got no doubt there are quite a number on this webinar at the moment. The challenge, and I get to deal with them fairly regularly, it's a challenge because of the interests that they bring to the table in relation to matters local. I'm thoughtful. I'm concerned about the idea is fine, but the practicality of it, Anthony, appears to me to be a bridge too far to try and bring these councillors together. If they can't agree around a table about things that they are collectively involved with themselves, how do you expect them to gather together as a collective? And you've nominated the fact that you need a number of people, a number of communities to make it work. Without that weight, you don't have a result. It's a challenge.
I've got 2 points. The first is the grow or go chat. This is the reality, and you don't have to change, and you don't have to stay. And you can continue with rural decline, regional decline, sucking our young people to the cities, which will be accelerated by the current processes. You don't have to change. There's no compulsion. Second one is, I think as communities, we need to be asking the bigger questions in terms of looking at in whose interests are we acting. And if I could take the caravan industry, caravan parks as one example, we know that people who run caravan parks in regional communities can be very influential in shaping council policies, and we've certainly seen it in Queensland, where, for example, there's no free camping or there's no low-cost camping, given the industry is incredibly self-sufficient these days. So basically what's happening is a whole bunch of nomads are avoiding towns where you can't have low-cost camping and going to other places because the person on council who owns a caravan park says there cannot be any free camping, they must all stay in my caravan park. So towns are losing whole bunches of money because one person wants to progress their interest at the cost of everyone else. So the bigger questions need to be on the agenda as to in whose interest are people acting and what is the impact of their decisions. So yes, there's going to be some ruffling of the feathers. And look, I think there's also, and I really feel this, is that there's a question in the regions of why bother. And I meant it when I said, people own sports clubs, they own God, and they run the sports club. They run the churches. That these people are very influential, and at times people can be quite intimidating. But I think it's time for a question. In whose interest are we operating, and what's the net impact? And as I said, there's no necessity that. I mean, as one commentator said, the regions will still be there. The question is whether they'll be populated, and to what extent they'll be populated, or whether we see the effect of sponge towns grow and grow and grow.
But who asked those questions, Anthony? Who's the person or the collective in those communities who ask those questions of their local government, and those people who are in fact sitting and watching, the frog slowly boiling, and they're in the pond in the pot with them? Who are they? Are they new young people coming to town? Are they the people who are driving through and make observations about what a wonderful place this is? Why don't you think about blah blah blah? I mean, the intellect that you need to drive the change that you're talking about obviously isn't in a number of these places, because they're sitting the way they are, and they will die on the vine, as you've indicated.
I've only done 1 or 2 studies on this, so I don't think I can be really definitive about it. But we do see in the studies we've done so far that women are marginalised from decision making as a group in regional Australia. I mean, sorry, it's blokes like you and me,
yeah, white bloke. White, yeah, that's it.
Dead white men need to make some room for other people and to create other forums for decision making. In another lecture, we could go through who's at the table and who's not. I don't have that data before me at the moment, but it does very much exist. And it very much, so when I mentioned before, I wasn't being flippant about the CWA feeling they're excluded from decision making. It came straight out of our last study of what drives mid-sized regional towns. So yeah, we can identify, and you can identify in your own community who's at the table and who's not. And maybe it's a role for the local media to be running this discussion about who believes they're heard, who's there's not, but even just down to, how do we run a consultation? How do we do decision making? I mean, we need to go beyond having a community consultation and we just base it on who turns up.
Yeah.
Sorry.
They say the world is run by those people who do turn up, and those who turn up are frequently. There's the other saying is, Anthony, if there's a horse called self-interest running, then you got to back it because it's trying exceptionally hard. I don't know how we get past that. A refugee's an answer. Here's something just to chuck it into the pile. Why don't we actually introduce to regional Australia all of those refugees who are looking for somewhere to go and have a job at and work and provide opportunity to? Is that a bit too far left field?
I've got a colleague working on the whole question of adaptive capacity. And I think the question we're dealing with here is that when people with new skills come to town, do we use them? Do we accept them? Or do they have to be, what's Jen Cleary calls them plulus and plunus. We like people like us, and we don't listen to people who are not like us. Again, survival is not compulsory, but we do know that generally speaking, we're not utilising the adaptive capacity, the new skill sets, energies, etc., that comes to town. Although we did see in Yalgoo in Western Australia for a while there, a couple moved up into the inlands to the east of Geraldton there and brought up a farm. And the lady who was co-running the farm became president of the Shire Council. And I asked, well, why was that? And it was, of course, they needed someone with the energy and the vision and the drive, and the rest of them were buggered and they were prepared to give her a go. So again, it's not out of the question. But at the same time, I don't want to boo-hoo the people who are at the table trying to make a difference, because there are people there.
They're working, they're doing it. They're committing their time and energy.
Yeah, and we'd be stuffed without them. But it's the bigger question of, it's not just about, how I grow my caravan park or get everyone to come to my pub. It's bigger questions than that.
As a specific question, Anthony, from John Mearns, who says his mental health seems to be taking a back seat to things that will make such as our state climb out of this financial crisis. My wife is a mental health nurse, lecturer and counsellor who can't get back into the mental health stream because no money is being supplied to fund the extra people needed. my letters to Minister Cook ignored. He came out this past weekend acknowledging that the mental health issues aligned to COVID pressure, workers on mines, etc., now do 14 on, 14 off. That's a great way to see if COVID persists. And as an ex-mine worker, 2 weeks in isolation raises mental issues. We need a mental health population, or a mentally healthy population, to champion what you, Anthony, are aspiring towards?
Look, there's several points there. The first and not least of which is that I wrote up before about ANOMI, future shock, and I think it's affected us all. I mean, we've majorly all had our lives turned on their heads, and we're all dealing with ourselves and coping with family members who are isolated and we can't get to them, because they're interstate and whatever. And how do we just get through this short-term problem, let alone before we go to issues of systemic mental health recovery? I mean, this has been a national trauma, and we need to manage it as a trauma, and people are affected and will be affected for some time. The systemic question which your questioner raises is that we already know that in the regions we've had a shortfall in allied health staff. And we know that there's a shortfall in career paths and the shortfall in funding. Like in Broome, for example, you can get an entry-level job or you're the boss, and if you want to do anything else, you've got to leave because there's no career path. We know the funding hasn't been there. We know that with the current issues, say like with the NDIS, we don't have make it work schemes, and if I don't remember, let me come back to it. So you got a person who's working a couple of days in NDIS and a couple of days in mental health and a couple of days here, and they're all casual. We don't have processes where government funding can be pooled to support a mental health worker in this area to meet the needs of XYZ people, because we have not got funding, flexible funding rules to enable that to happen. So, look, I don't want to risk doing platitudes here in terms of mental health, other than to recognise and validate the person's issue, that it's a huge gap and this exacerbates that problem. But there are also funding barriers, as he notes, that stop us going forward there.
Mm. The other question that you raised, or that you mentioned in passing, was about you hiring. You should stop hiring a person. You should be buying a family. Does that increase the intellectual horsepower, the collective growth of the communities within regional centres, if that's in fact a way of adding to the population?
Well, it's interesting is if we're going to recruit, say, a doctor to the community, what happens to their partners, a psychologist or a business manager? How do we create the second job? Do we create the second job? And again, this comes back to where we work at a regional level to have the funds to support both careers. This is where part of what I'm thinking where we need to be focusing funds is that when we bring a person, we can create a job for the partner, and we can create the money that enables them to maintain their professional life and their links to the cities, which are so critical in terms of their professional work and their development and the like. But at the moment, we don't have those. So I've got to decide, or we've got to decide as a family, Robert, do I move to Toowoomba and one of us gets there and I get a job at USC and bugger my wife and she can work it out later? And Toowoomba is a town of some size. But, if I'm going to Cloncurry or Mount Isa, then how do we cater for the second person? Well, if we can't cater for the second person, that's a family decision. And what are the impacts, and how does the family decide that? Or do we flick it around and saying, in order to grow our regions, we need to invest in the two people, or whoever, and how do we take that forward at a regional level? What's the pot of money that's available to make that happen? Yeah.
There's a question from Matt Fetlow, who says he's got some interesting observations. We can learn much from Scotland, who have local governance structures called development trusts. They are locally led and focus on long-term community, economic and environmental development. There are 270 now across Scotland, way over represented in rural areas. They have been tremendously successful and often bypass local authorities and traditional influences. Is the structure of government in Australia with a federal, state and local government need a shake-up, Anthony?
Well, thanks for an easy question.
And are you aware of the Scottish Yeah, well, you want the easy ones, go and talk to Channel 9.
Look, it was interesting, and we've had this battle over the regional development Australia groups for the last 10 years with, under the previous administration, we had the executive RDAs advising the ministers that they had processes in place which people seem reasonably happy with. I don't know if the people online here have comments about that. Look, what's really been really interesting about COVID is that possibly other than WA, we've probably realised as a nation we don't really have effective regions, let alone effective regional governance structures. Because the WA's got the Gascoyne, the Kimberley, so they're very clear about what their regions are, and then how to operate at a regional level. Most of us don't have that, and the RDAs were this kind of strange other anomaly, which might have been good for planning, but they were. This is part of what we need to think about at the regions. What are the new institutional frameworks that we develop? Because we're still very much working from the post-war model where we had the church charities and cooperatives and whatever that all formed around taking our life forward, and we had the cooperatives for various farming things, which are all changing shape, but we haven't now developed new institutional frameworks. You can never imagine that states are going to give up their powers to allow regional governance to become its own form. Maybe not in my lifetime anyway, but there does need to be a regional decision-making process that has some place at the decision-making table, that has some bite and certainly has some money to spend.
Did the Barnaby Joyce option and Armidale get you excited when he announced it?
Well, it was a complete disaster, wasn't it? Again, the first adage is you hire a family, you don't hire an individual. It was career death for people, for the APVMA to move to Armidale, because absolutely no other career options, let alone what their partners were doing. It completely dislocated people from the fabric of how the policy making as a nation happened, because we have no other infrastructure around that allowed them to link into all the other decision making stuff and all the networks that are so critical to policy decision making. I don't even think we had a direct flight from Armidale to Canberra.
You go into Toowoomba, into the new privately owned airport there in Toowoomba, and drive down to Armidale.
What's going on here? We know it's a quick way to let's turn around a good example. When we had the 2003 fires in Canberra, we lost Mount Stromlo, the Space Observatory Station, and people had to move out to my sticks, out to Coonabarabran, to Siding Springs, where the instrumentality was still in place. And what you're seeing there is a necessary and logical flow of talent. People have moved there and built houses. You've increased your adaptive capacity, intellectual capacity. You've increased your local economy, because Coonabarabran had something to offer and something can be grown from there. Stromlo is continuing. But simply just grab a bunch of public servants and stick them in the middle of nowhere is a short-term fix that kind of goes back to my caravan analogy, that puts money in the pockets of local business and local economy, but it's not actually creating endogenous growth. It's not it's a quick fix, it's not a long-term strategy, and it's popularist rather than being strategic.
We've got 5 minutes to be finished, and Kate will pull the bang on us in about 4.5 minutes' time. I want you to go back to your take-home messages in just a second. This is from a Murdoch paper on the weekend. You can see it sitting there. I read the front page of this thing, and it says this is the quality magazine. It says big push for the bush, and it says supersizing regional centres could play a key role in South Australia's economic recovery. A new report says the state has one of the most concentrated populations in Australia, with more than 3 in 4 people living in metropolitan Adelaide. Infrastructure SA Chief Executive Jeremy Conway told the Sunday Mail it was important to focus on increasing services in the bush, even if the population was not there yet to justify them. And then the story goes on. Are things happening? Do you think, Anthony?
Well, if you take Coober Pedy as an example, the Cooper PD is being serviced, so like in expert medical services out of Adelaide. It's some of it is highly contentious because we're having to send in multiple teams because that community A won't be in a place where community B is, etc. Adelaide is incredibly, the South Australia is incredibly urbanised. The question is, what are you going to get to do me to move to Whyalla or to Ceduna? What's going to be there for me? What is the transition plan? I mean, Ceduna, what a beautiful town, what a magnificent bay, and you know, and you've got all that outback at your footsteps. How's it going to happen? That's the question. And I mean, this is the kind of utopian but not strategic suggestion. Yes, I think regions coming out of COVID are incredibly appealing places to live, but I mean, at the moment, like Cooper PD wouldn't have the housing, wouldn't have the services. You'd be doing leapfrog for quite some time before you got to a point where people wanting to go there. So this is where we go back to the 2050 vision of, you know, we're looking at generational change. We need to do this in doable pieces that build on each other. We're just not going to go from A to B overnight, as much as it would be great to be able to live in that wonderful place as Ceduna and go fishing there and enjoy that great coastline. And
the oysters. Let's go back to the takeaway points, please. Anthony, we've got 3 minutes. 2 minutes and 50 seconds.
You know, I've just got to go back there. I've got to go back to share my screen again. Where am I?
There's some good material coming on the questions, which Kate is dealing with, which is fantastic. So your summary, Anthony, is?
Let's move away from, have I lost my screen again? I have. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. So as much as those bundles of money of $300 or $400 billion seem, when we divide them by 50 regions and divide them down to years, it's not a lot of money. And they're really just doing stuff for the most part that's cost of entry. Yeah, I need my medical centre. Yes, we do need a grain handling facility. Yes, we do need to fix them an Angle railway bridge because the trains can't cross it. Really entry level stuff. But we need to get to where the Europeans have gone, and that we're actually investing in smart specialisation of growing local industries, thinking laterally, thinking vertically, thinking about how we connect to do new stuff, and that requires investment. Your other point is that it takes time and it takes a vision. That if you look at what happened with Derby in Tasmania, it actually was a statewide endeavour to get the land reallocated from mines and national parks and to free up. You know, that we have to have collaboration. It's critical. But these people had a vision and they took it forward and they made it happen, and the economics were fantastic. And it's brought life into a town that was otherwise, you know, really, you know, facing sunset clauses. All they had was a bit of a tourist industry going around the old tin mines there. And now it's just completely revitalised that whole region. So like area like over in Mandurah up in Western Australia, they're doing mountain bikes. We can't all do mountain bikes, but we need to move on.
Okay. Anthony, our time has gone. Thank you seriously for your contribution. It's been the response from people who are listening at the moment has been very positive, and they've appreciated the good work you put into this. So on their behalf and mine, thank you very much for your presentation this morning.
I don't know if I can get to see the comments. I hope I can. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Listen, if I could just thank you and Ian for your contributions today. That's been a really challenging session, and I've enjoyed it a lot. I noticed you referred to Jen Cleary a couple of times, Anthony. She's on the 3rd of June. So people who interest was piqued by Anthony's comments, we will be hearing from Jen Cleary on the 3rd of June. But this Friday, the 22nd of May, we'll be talking on the topic Thriving Coasts, which will drive and issues that will drive economic growth and recovery, helping to advance production and sustainable industries and build long-term resilience in Australia's vital coastal communities. So that's this week, and next week we'll on the Wednesday we'll be doing a deeper dive into the diagram that Robert's been creating, and that was the basis of the special edition SEGRA communique. So lots of things on the program, and we look forward to you joining us at a later date. But thanks again, Anthony, very much for your well put together presentation, and Ian for your conversation. Thank you.